July 17, 2028. The American heartland didn't just go silent. It was silenced by a shadow that hopped across the border and rewrote the laws of physics with a single strike. This was the day the world realized the food chain had been flipped upside down. It wasn't a foreign army or a natural disaster that brought the Lone Star State to its knees. It was something far more primal, possessing the power to shatter concrete and the speed to outrun the wind. The enemy didn't come to negotiate or claim resources. They came with a physical intensity that local infrastructure was never designed to handle. And they brought a terrifying synchronized intent that no one saw coming. It started as a ripple in the heat haze near the outskirts of El Paso. Ranchers, men who had spent their lives staring at the horizon, noticed something wrong with the rising dust clouds. These weren't the erratic swirls of a windstorm or the slow drift of a cattle drive. These clouds were rhythmic, pounding, and moving with a calculated, terrifying speed. At first, the reports were dismissed as heat-induced hallucinations or a mass migration of displaced wildlife. But the cell phone footage that began to flood the internet told a different story. It showed thousands of massive, muscular silhouettes moving at 40 miles per hour across the Panhandle. By sunrise, the Texas border looked as if the Australian outback had ripped a hole in reality and poured itself straight into the American Southwest. The red shadow had arrived, and it brought a level of aggression that defied every biological precedent. These weren't the herbivorous creatures seen in nature documentaries. Something in their genetic code, or perhaps a sudden evolutionary leap, had transformed them into biological sledgehammers. They stood over 7 feet tall, with chests like heavy-duty barrels and forelimbs thick enough to rival a professional heavyweight. Their hind legs were no longer just tools for movement. They were precision instruments capable of delivering thousands of pounds of force. Their tails, thick and muscular, acted as deadly counterweights, allowing them to pivot with a grace that mocked their immense size. The first major confrontation occurred at a small cattle ranch outside of Lubbock. The owner, a veteran cattleman, described a low-frequency drumming that vibrated the glass in his windows long before the shapes appeared. He didn't see an animal. He saw a wall of muscle. They didn't graze on his land. They moved through his fences as if the barbed wire were made of spider silk. When he tried to intervene, he realized the terrifying truth. These beings weren't reacting with the fear of a wild animal. They were reacting with the calculated precision of a fighter. They used their forelimbs to grapple and their hind legs to dismantle everything in their path. They weren't hunting for food. They were establishing dominance. As the days passed, the phenomenon escalated from a localized anomaly into a full-scale regional crisis. The creatures, dubbed the Red Shadows by those who survived the initial encounters, began to demonstrate a level of social organization that defied explanation. They didn't hunt in packs. They operated in mobs, utilizing boxing techniques that their ancestors might have used for mating rituals, but perfected here for total territorial control. They moved with a hive mind efficiency, cutting off secondary roads and surrounding small towns before the residents even knew they were being observed. They seemed to understand the importance of movement and the strategic value of the very terrain the locals took for granted. Interstate 40, a vital artery of American commerce, became a graveyard of stalled and overturned vehicles. It wasn't a sudden blockade. It was a systematic shutdown. Drivers reported seeing shapes pacing their cars at highway speeds, staring through the windows with dark, unblinking eyes. Then came the impacts. A single kick to a moving tire would send a semi-truck spiraling into the median. The sound of these encounters was a haunting symphony of the desert. The wet smack of powerful limbs against metal, the crunch of structural steel, and that endless, rhythmic thud of feet hitting the sun-baked earth. The red shadows weren't just fast, they were relentless, pacing the fastest vehicles until the drivers succumbed to panic or fatigue. The psychological toll on the population was immediate and devastating. In the towns that were cut off, the silence was the most oppressive part. The power lines were often the first to go, pulled down not by wind, but by the sheer weight of the creatures as they explored the verticality of their new environment. People huddled in their homes, listening to the sound of heavy breathing outside their doors and the scratching of claws against the siding. There was a sense that the world had been reclaimed by a force that didn't care for human technology or human laws. The feeling of being an intruder in one's own home became the new reality for millions. Texas Ranger Elena Voss was part of a small tactical response team sent into the quiet zones to assess the damage and find a way to break the siege. Her recovered logs provide the most chilling insight into the behavior of the red shadows. She noted that they didn't seem interested in traditional spoils. They didn't want the food supplies or the shelters. They seemed to be testing themselves against the environment. Voss described watching a group of them standing in the middle of a deserted main street, practicing their movements in a way that looked like a choreographed drill. They were learning the terrain, studying the way humans moved, and adapting their tactics in real time.
They were no longer just animals. They were
students of conflict. Voss's final transmission is a masterclass in atmospheric dread. She described a night where the moon was so bright it turned the red dust of Texas into a landscape of rust and silver. She was hiding behind her cruiser, her team scattered, as dozens of silhouettes hopped closer with an eerie, silent grace. She whispered into her recorder that they were no longer just reacting. They were watching the way her team used cover. They were circling, waiting for the moment her breathing became labored. The last frame of her body cam, now locked away in a high-security facility, shows a 9-foot alpha male standing directly in front of her. It didn't growl or hiss. It simply looked into the lens with a deep, ancient intelligence, as if it understood exactly what the device was recording. The government's response was hampered by the sheer absurdity of the situation. How do you declare a state of emergency against a biological entity that doesn't use weapons, yet can disable a tank's treads with a well-placed strike? Conventional strategies failed because the red shadows didn't follow the rules of engagement. They disappeared into the canyons when heavy patrols arrived and reappeared in the heart of residential neighborhoods the moment the armor moved out. They utilized the geography of Texas, the vast, empty spaces and the rugged terrain, better than the people who had lived there for generations. They turned the state's size and isolation into a tactical disadvantage for the defenders. Within weeks, the social fabric of the region began to fray. The "Don't mess with Texas" slogans took on a dark, ironic undertone. The pride of the state, its rugged individualism and its strength, was being systematically dismantled by an opponent that possessed those same qualities in excess. The red shadows had turned the vastness of the American West against its inhabitants. They used the highways as their own private corridors, and the abandoned cities as their training grounds. The once bustling energy sector was paralyzed as workers refused to go to the sites, fearing the shapes that watched them from the tops of the oil derricks. Scientists who managed to observe the creatures from a distance theorized that a massive environmental shift, or a hidden genetic trigger, had caused this sudden migration and aggression. They spoke of rapid adaptive evolution, a process where a species changes its behavior and physical capabilities in a matter of months rather than millennia. But for those on the ground, the scientific why didn't matter. What mattered was the reality of the new lone star. It was a reality where the night belonged to the drumming of legs across the desert, and the morning brought the sight of new territories claimed by the shadows. The human inhabitants were no longer the masters of the plains. They were the observers. As the months dragged on, a strange and tense kind of coexistence began to form in the outskirts of the occupied zones. People learned to move only during the heat of midday when the creatures were less active. They reinforced their homes with materials meant to withstand high-velocity impacts. But even then, the sense of security was an illusion. The red shadows were always there, a constant presence on the edge of the light, a reminder that the world can change in an instant when nature decides to strike back. They were the new guardians of the desert, and they were not looking for peace. There are stories now, whispered in the camps of displaced residents, about the boxing cities. These are the urban centers like Amarillo and Midland that were completely overtaken and became the hubs of the Red Shadow Territory. They say that at night, the sound of the creature's ritualistic combat can be heard for miles, a rhythmic, percussive sound that echoes off the glass skyscrapers. They aren't just surviving, they are building a society of their own, one based on the purity of strength and the dominance of the physical form. The city streets, once filled with the sound of engines and conversation, now echo with the thud of heavy landings and the sharp cracks of impact. Today, a large portion of the state remains under the unofficial control of the Red Shadow. The maps still show the old borders, the old names of the towns, and the old routes of the highways, but those are just relics of a previous era. The new map is written in the patterns of the mobs and the territories of the alphas. The Red Shadow over Texas isn't just a news headline or a passing crisis. It is a permanent shift in the American landscape. It serves as a haunting mystery of how quickly the familiar can become alien and how easily the hunters can become the hunted. The state's identity has been forcibly rewritten by an intruder that speaks only in the language of force. The world watches from a distance, wondering if the Red Shadows will stay within the borders they have claimed, or if the drumming will soon be heard in the suburbs of the east and the valleys of the west. Every time a car backfires or a heavy weight hits the floor, people look to the horizon with a new kind of fear.
Oh my God.
They look for the dust cloud that moves against the wind. They listen for the sound of 1,000 heartbeats hitting the ground at once. The phenomenon has sparked a global conversation about the fragility of human dominance and the untapped power of the natural world. So, the next time you see a postcard of the wide Texas plains or a bumper sticker proclaiming the state's indomitable spirit, remember that there is another power there now. A power that doesn't use words, doesn't follow laws, and doesn't know the meaning of surrender. They brought the endurance of the outback to the heart of the Union, and they brought the strength to back it up. They are a living testament to the idea that we are only as strong as the environment allows us to be. What would you do if you looked out your window tomorrow morning and saw a 7-foot silhouette standing in your driveway, staring back at you with the calm confidence of a creature that knows it has already won? How would you react when you realize that your locks, your fences, and your technology are nothing more than toys to a shadow that has decided to stay? The mystery of why they came may never be solved, but the reality of their presence is written in every silent street and every dented car across the desert. The Red Shadow is no longer a legend. It is the new master of the plains, and the drumming is getting closer every night. Do you think this is a localized event, or is it the beginning of a global reclamation? Share your thoughts below.